Welcome everyone to the second annual Does God Matter Q&A panel. Please feel free to ask all the questions you want. We'll have the microphone set up right here for you. And if you're a little nervous or camera shy, feel free to ask one of your friends wearing the blue OSO logo shirts to come up here and ask it for you. My name is Trevor, and I am one of the senior officers for OSO Logos. And today, OSO Logos is the primary sponsor for this event. But we also have to thank Austin Egbert, the president of ASA, for also co-sponsoring our event tonight. We'll continue to allow you to get pizza, drinks throughout the entire event. Please feel free to take as much as you want and take it after the event's over because we don't want to have any back at our houses. It's not healthy for us. And come see us afterwards if you have any questions that you still haven't gotten to ask or would like to just ask more in a personal conversation. All of us here at OSO Logos would love to speak to you about anything related to God, faith, and what you believe and why you should believe it. And next week, if you are interested, you can come to our general meetings, which happen at the same time in Rogers. And we'll actually be having Dr. Marks, our moderator for tonight, speaking on the Christians in science. And if some of that interests you, you might want to come by and check us out. And now I will be introducing our moderator for tonight. Dr. Marks is a distinguished professor of electrical and computer engineering, and he's the director of the Walter Bradley Center for Natural and Artificial Intelligence at the Discovery Institute. And he's a beloved longtime faculty advisor for OSO Logos, and he will be our MC for tonight. So please join me in welcoming our panel.
Thank you very much. Should I stand up or no? Okay, I'll just talk right here. You know, the great physicist who recently passed away, Stephen Hawking, in his book, A Brief History of Time, said something which I found fascinating. He said, nothing in physics is ever proven. Rather, we just accumulate evidence. And I think the same thing is true for belief in God and also Christianity. One does not, it's a very famous saying, one cannot prove God, but one indeed can accumulate evidence for the existence of God, for the truth of Christianity, and that's what we're here tonight to talk about. So as you look closer and closer at things, I think, in my case, the more I become convinced that it is indeed the right way to look at things. So we have a really distinguished panel here tonight. I'm going to introduce them, and then after the introduction, we're going to ask you to come up, if you're so led, and ask questions about any questions that you have about God, faith, Christianity, just about anything. We're open to anything. And I think that we have an expertise here tonight. We have students in apologetics, we have philosophers, and other good people, and an engineer. So it should be good. Our panel tonight includes Matthew Anderson. Matthew, he's pursuing a PhD in philosophy and Christian ethics from Oxford University. And in conversation right before here, I found out he's going to get his PhD in 2 weeks.
About that.
Okay, 2 weeks. So Oxford University, such a good deal. He is also an associate fellow at Oxford at the McDonald Center for Christian Ethics. Currently, he's on a postdoctoral research. He's a postdoctoral research fellow here at Baylor at the Institute for the Study of Religion. Also on the panel is Todd Buras. Todd, there you are. Wave your hand. Okay. He's on the philosophy department. He has a PhD from Yale, and his specialization is the history of modern philosophy. He has been published by Oxford University Press in terms of a very nice edited volume. He has many essays in leading journals, and he was the faculty steward at HRC here at Baylor from 2011 to 2015. The HRC is the Honors Residential College. He's an award-winning teacher. In fact, he was just awarded a Baylor Fellow honoring excellence in teaching. And that's a very, very prestigious award here at Baylor, and Todd won that. So, and he's also, by the way, one of the faculty advisors for OSO Logos. Also on the panel is Ryan Cruz. Ryan is I thought you were down there. Okay. He's the past president and founder of OSO Logos. He's a graduate of Baylor in business. He's a consultant currently for Credoa, and he's a student in apologetics. He really knows his stuff there. So we're delighted that Ryan can join us again after he's graduated and left Baylor and drove all the way here from Dallas, right? Also on the panel is Casey Sudduth. Casey has been involved in Summit Ministries in Colorado Springs. He's a marketing and religion major here at Baylor University, and he is the current president of Oso Logos. So would you join me in welcoming our panel here today? Okay, I'm official now. While we're waiting for some questions, I have some questions, and please, it takes guts to be the first one to come up and ask questions, so let's see if you have guts to come up and do that.
Well, but if nobody wants to ask the first question, please feel free to come up and ask the second. That's perfectly acceptable as well.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for
We'll
the
skip right to the second.
Okay, let me start out with some questions that I have. Recently, at a Jewish synagogue, a man came in with a semi-automatic weapon. He killed 11 people and wounded a number more of them. Some of the people that were killed were elderly people who had just celebrated celebrated their anniversary through a candlelight ceremony at Tree of Life, and it was just a slaughter, and it was terrible. And we hear about these things all over the place, these slaughters and these school shootings. The Amish school shooting where a number of children were actually taken out. So my first question to the panel is, if God is good and God is righteous, how can he allow things like this to happen in our world? Did I stump you?
Should I take a stab?
Okay. You've thought about this.
Well, Dr. Marks has given a really eloquent brief articulation of what we call in philosophy the problem of evil. It is by far and away the most serious challenge to thinking through the evidence for and against the existence of God. In fact, I normally would say to my students that setting aside the problem of evil, the case for God's existence is really a slam dunk. So it's really the biggest challenge there is, and in the history of Christian thinking about this and Christian philosophy about this, there have been a number of different strategies and ideas developed to try to answer the kind of question that was just asked. How could the evils we observe, particularly the evils just described, moral horrors of human beings against one another, how can we possibly imagine God permitting those? And by far and away, what I would call the majority report of the Christian tradition on this matter is that moral evils are the sort of thing that God does not will, but tolerates for the sake of a greater good, which is enabled by giving human beings the freedom to choose between right and wrong. The greater good is not itself freedom or free will. The greater good is the kinds of relationships that free will makes possible. Those kinds of relationships would include the highest sorts of loving relationships we're capable of imagining. They have to be freely chosen. In short, friendship. Friendship only comes to pass between people who have freely chosen to be in that relationship. And so, for the sake of the kinds of relationships that free will makes possible, the thinking has been that that would be the greater good there that God has in view is a morally sufficient reason to tolerate things that otherwise he would not ever want to come to pass. So it's the same kind of reasoning that we use in ordinary moral discourse, with one exception, which is to say most people don't think I'm a moral monster if I put my kid through a sort of torment for the sake of achieving immunity to disease, the torment he might have due to a phobia about needles and the requirement that he have a shot, because I was trying to achieve a much greater good by virtue of that suffering. But there's one difference between the kind of way I engage in that reasoning, where I have a morally sufficient reason to allow something that otherwise I would not prefer, and the way God does. And that's that the greater good in question is logically requires the free will. Not even an omnipotent being could bring about the greater goods without giving us the kind of free will. Whereas in my case, I can't bring about the greater goods of my son's health without putting him through the torment of a needle. And that's just because I'm too weak and too stupid to do it. In the case of God allowing moral evils for the sake of the greater good of loving friendship, the idea is that the free will that makes that possible is logically necessary. Not even God could make a world with that kind of friendship without giving us that kind of freedom. So I talked a while. You're gonna have to rein me in. I'm a philosophy professor. But other
It's
thoughts or
dangerous.
comments?
It's dangerous to give any professor a microphone.
Yeah.
Can I add
please.
from the explicitly Christian standpoint, because I think everything that Todd said is right and is explicitly Christian in a certain sense, but as someone whose field is theology, I have distinctive obligations to account for this problem in terms of the person of Jesus Christ. And while everything that Todd said is right, there's a supplement within the boundaries of Christian theology that would say something like, God himself takes one step further by participating in humanity's suffering in these particular ways, such that the death of the innocent man, Christ Jesus, is a kind of accounting for the horrendous evils that happen on a daily basis, such that we would be able to, in prayer and in our participation with Christ in a Christian life, in one sense, be able to see that God himself is not immune from the sort of suffering that we face, but God himself has brought himself near to us even in that suffering, and taken it into his own life in a very distinctive way. And so I think that's it can be hard to hear the kinds of defenses of the possibility that God would allow these things to happen, and I think they're all the right ones. But I think that a story about what the cross does provides a kind of compassion and a sense of pathos around it that is really necessary.
I also have an answer. I ask the questions, and some of them I have answers for. I think I'm an engineer, so I like logic. I'm a student of Kurt Gödel and self-refuting statements. And one of the interesting things about saying that something happened that was evil, there's a presupposition in there, and that presupposition is that there is good and evil. So we have this presupposition in the statement already. Well, if there's evil, there must be good. Well, if there's no God, there's no good and evil. Okay, everything just happens because it happens. Well, if there's evil, there's good. And then one must ultimately go to the question is, what is the source of that good? And the source of that good ultimately leads to, in some ways of reasoning, to the existence of God. What is the source of good and evil?
Dr. Marks, if I can add, I don't know if is my microphone working? Okay, kind of. One quick comment, and this is a very quick comment, and it's piggybacking off something that Matt said. Something that I want to remind everybody is, like Matt very correctly pointed out, that God in the Christian story participates in human suffering just as we do, and so in that way he identifies with us. But there's another important point to remember here that really should be rather obvious to everybody who's familiar with Christianity, but that I think that we often overlook, is that in the Christian story, these moral evils are not the end of the story. Those who died in the synagogue, those who die every day all over the world, that is not the end of their story if you take the Christian worldview at its face value. And so that really, then it becomes a question, well, is Christianity true? But here's the thing, if Christianity is true, think about it in mathematics. When you have a limit that approaches infinity, no matter any number, no matter how large, approaches zero. Okay, all the suffering and evil that could take place here on this earth during our 80 years of life, even over the course of all of human history, it approaches zero in light of infinity. And so that's just something to keep in mind, that that's really not the end of the story. And God has done something about evil on the cross, as Matt said. So I just wanted to throw that reminder out there, not to get the evangelistic call to the altar right at the very beginning, but but just wanted to make sure that wasn't overlooked.
Can I ask the next question? Am I allowed to ask?
Yeah, I guess so.
Okay.
Probably better than I have.
Well, I'm just curious, and this is something we've talked about with a few different people at OSO meetings this semester. It's kind of this idea of, okay, sure, even if we've got the logical side of it figured out, say, okay, maybe it doesn't make sense. Maybe this only makes sense if you start with God. If you assume that good and evil even exist in the first place. But nonetheless, how do you go about handling something like the shooting that just happened? I mean, you don't just walk up and say, oh, well, if you look at it logically in free will, and you have to have this type of relationships. So how do you handle this kind of thing with grace, especially with something that someone that you're just, that you're close with? That's something that I've always struggled with, because, I mean, as a lot of people that especially the ones that do philosophy, like the guys on this panel, and theology for Matt. But I think that's something that's like, okay, well, I can maybe say I'm just going to try to think about it in my head and figure it all out. But in terms of actually, boots on the ground, how do we actually deal with this kind of stuff? I think that's a lot harder thing, at least for me to do. So I'm curious if you guys have insights on that.
I would like to say something about it, and especially since I started off with the what may seem a very and is called traditionally a logically defensive point about belief in God, which is, I don't think when you're dealing with suffering and confronting suffering that it's the right time to philosophize. And I didn't mean to give that impression. I'm afraid I did. So I'm glad you asked the question, Casey. So I do think there is a place for philosophy in addressing the suffering, in that in many cases the suffering, certainly in my own case, as I've encountered the mild suffering I've had to endure, very often the philosophical question and problem is part of my suffering. I want to see how it could make sense. And so the philosophy aids in that regard. But for most people, that may not be the case. In any case, it takes pastoral judgment, I think, to know what is the case. And by and large, I think the church's witness to the world that's suffering is to come alongside, bear, comfort, bind up, heal, protect. And in that respect, God's best answer to the problem of evil is really the work of the church in the world as minister of healing and peace. So that's really where the conversation should have started. I'm sorry.
Todd, there's no reason to apologize. I mean, one wants the reasons in advance because the suffering is inevitable, right? And that's the thing, right? Like, there's no escaping the suffering in this world. In your own discipline, Hobbes, life can be nasty, brutish, and short for a lot of people, and there's no escaping the reality that, for now, at least, we're all going to die. And you want to reflect on that and have the reasons in advance before the suffering hits you, such that when the suffering hits you, you have the clear-eyed judgment to account for what you're going through. And so I think the reasons, you can't discount the value of the kinds of reasons that Todd laid out.
Well, thank you. Let's move on. Please, again, if you do have a question, please come up to the microphone. And the first
form a line.
The first person will get a free box of pizza. Okay.
Yeah, I just want to make
state your name and then your question.
Dan Ogden. I teach in the business school, also Baylor's director of export compliance. I just wanted to make one comment. I'd be curious to get the panel's response. One thing we have to remember is the fall of man brought sin into the world. And if God were to prevent every evil act from occurring, basically the judgment of sin would be abrogated. Because if God was to prevent every single thing, then there would be no consequence of sin. And that's just a reality. Now, what we also don't know, things that God prevents, there's no way to measure those things. So it could be that only one tenth of the potential evil acts that mankind has are actually occurring. We have no way to measure that. I think we just have to remember we live in a fallen world where sin is a reality. And if God were to prevent any sin from occurring, then the judgment of sin that was brought upon mankind would be abrogated. I think we must not forget that.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Was there a question there?
No, I just was wondering if there are any comments on that.
Okay.
That was just my
Okay, thank you. Please state your name and then your question.
Hi, I'm Reese Alexander. I'm a freshman business fellow. So I have a question for the ethics person and the business person. So in the Bible, you can say that it has themes of how the poor are the most holy and how the wealthy man, it's harder to get into heaven than it is to get a camel through the eye of a needle, and so on. So how are we supposed to reconcile the American dream and the idea that we're pursuing wealth and we're pursuing higher standards of living and so on for ourselves? How are we supposed to reconcile that in a Christian ideology?
Good question.
Do you want to start?
Do you want to go?
Sure. Yeah, happy to. Yeah, so that is a good question, and I think that's definitely pertinent for somebody in my position. So this is my passion, but what I do in my day job is I am a management consultant for a technology solutions firm up in Dallas, and certainly we're front and center in the business community where my job is to help improve our clients' bottom line, right? And so that certainly is, in a sense, materialistic. And so it's a fair question. I think there's a couple of things going on here, and I'm going to try to give a very quick treatment of each one of them, and so none of them will be wholly sufficient, but hopefully it'll kind of steer us in the right direction. The first thing I think to keep in mind is that in Jesus' ministry, he certainly is identifying with the outcasts, but it's not just the poor. Jesus identifies with the poor because they are the marginalized ones in first century Palestinian society and in the Roman Empire, but it's not just the poor that he identifies with. Jesus also makes a point to go out of his way to identify with sinners, to identify with tax collectors who are actually wealthy individuals, but are on the fringe of first century Palestinian society because they're viewed by their compatriots as being traitors who sellouts to the Roman Empire. He associates with Gentiles, with people Samaritans, people that you typically don't think of as the in crowd back in that day. So I think there's more to that question of what is Jesus' ministry focus than just the poor being poor in the material sense, although that is certainly true. But now here's the second thing that I want to mention. Jesus, I think the problem here is that for people who are materialistically focused, you make that your God. Jesus reminded his disciples that you can't serve two masters. You can't serve both the Lord and money. And I think what he means by that, and I certainly feel this often, the pull to do something because it's a great career move or because it gives you more long-term potential, earnings potential, rather than doing something that would further your ministry. That's certainly a very, very real concern for Christians in business who also have a kind of ministry bent in their life. And so really it becomes a matter of priority. Are you willing to make God your master over your material possessions, over your career, over whatever it is that you're chasing after? And I think that's really what comes down to it. And then the final thing that I'll say very, very quickly is that Jesus certainly, while this message is definitely clear, he wasn't against material possession. He encouraged good stewardship of those possessions. And the parable that I want to draw your attention to is the parable of the talents. There were two servants, or maybe there were three, who Jesus gave them talents, money, in the Roman Empire. And he said in the parable that the master went away on a journey, and each servant was to do something with those talents. Now, one of those servants buried the talent, didn't do anything with it, and so it didn't earn interest or anything like that. He just buried it to keep his master's money safe. Another one of those servants went out and spent the talent to build a business and gain interest on it, and so he accumulated more wealth, and when his master returned, he shared that wealth with him. And Jesus, in the parable, the master commends the servant who is industrious with the resources that he's been given, and he actually chastises the servant who doesn't do anything with it. And so what we're seeing here is an encouragement to be good stewards of what we're given. Now, you can't tyrannize that stewardship in the sense to make it all about you, but at the same time, I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with accumulating things as long as you use those for a good purpose, if you're stewarding those resources well. It is certainly true that there are many ministries on the earth that could do much, much better if they had more resources. And so certainly I don't think this is a case where we want to tell those people, no, rejoice in your poverty because Jesus loved the poor, and they would fight back, okay, but I can't help these people because I don't have enough resources. I can't get food and water to these victims of this hurricane because we don't have the capital to do that. So that was longer than I intended it to be, but hopefully that kind of helped us steer in the right direction.
So it's a good question. I'd say a couple things very briefly. One, I'm not entirely convinced that they are commensurate. that the gospel is commensurate with this particular Christian vision as you laid it out. And I think we need to think through the ways in which the scriptures do challenge certain conceptions of life and death within American society and the material resources that we think are required to do those things well. The second thing that I would say is we'd have to think through, to answer it fully, what poverty and wealth are. Because poverty and wealth are material conditions, but they're social realities. And those who are poor are deprived of certain needs that impair their bodily lives in a lot of cases, but they're also disconnected from certain social structures that are essential for their flourishing. And so whatever sort of response to those who are in need we would want to support within the gospel would have to have both a combination of material concern but also social concern, money as well as time. I think that we seriously discount the value of time spent with those who are in need. The third thing I'd say is that the principalities and powers within the Christian story are real. These economics, finance, these are systems and institutions of our society that structure how our ordinary lives go in ways that are invisible to most of us. We don't reflect about them and we don't encounter them directly. And that means that there's lots of room for critique. But there is, I think, as Casey also pointed out, lots of room for affirmation and approval in how the gospel and the way in which it talks about wealth and poverty intersects with a 21st century economy, which is very different than, in some ways, a first century economy is, I think, just one of the hardest questions that Christians in America and really around the world face today. So if you want to talk more about that, I can steer you towards resources, but I think it is a really good question.
Thank you. Let's go on to another question. Maya, sorry.
Hello. Okay. Can you give some sort of proof or explanation for the doctrine of original sin? And also, following that, if Jesus is a human as well as like fully human and fully God, how does Jesus not have original sin? Thanks.
Todd, you want to answer that?
I will say, the Chesterton quote.
Yeah, we were all going to reach for the Chesterton quote. This is where we were all headed, right?
Yeah. The Chesterton quote definitely deserves to be mentioned when he suggests that the doctrine of original sin is the only, he may have said, or maybe the most verified empirically, the most well-verified empirical claim in Christian teaching, meaning that it is proved with every child.
You can see it in the streets.
So in one respect, the doctrine of original sin, the evidence, I think the thought behind that brilliant quip is that the evidences of original sin are everywhere present.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it's hard to come up with a proof for a doctrine like that. The question of Christ so if you aren't familiar with the doctrine of original sin, it's essentially the idea within Christian theology that each individual is conceived, born, sort of inherits a nature which is itself already disordered. That you're sort of off the rails before you have the opportunity to make a choice. One of my favorite books that's very salty, for which I apologize, is Francis Spuford's book Unapologetic, which is a very cheerful, very, very salty defense of Christianity. And he describes the doctrine of original sin as the, if I may say so, the human propensity to F things up. Which I think is actually a pretty apt description for the doctrine. There's a human propensity that is kind of baked in, as it were, to screw things up. Christ himself shares all of our natural infirmities, to quote one of the Reformed catechisms. So Christ is conceived clearly in a miraculous way. He's conceived by the Holy Ghost. And the conception of Christ in the womb of Mary is a radical, irrepeatable moment in human existence where where a human being comes to be without a father. And he's conceived directly through the agency of the Holy Spirit, and in such a way that he still shares, I think the language of natural infirmities is the right language. He still has his propensity to stub his toe if he trips. He still has he's still bound to time. He ages. He presumably, were he to live long enough, he would within this world age in such a way that he might approach death, right? He shares all that is human about us, but without the propensity to screw things up. And how does that happen? At the end of the day, it is a miracle, right? It's a miracle in the sense that it's an irrepeatable act of God to assume a human nature in this particular way that lacks this particular feature. And I don't know if I can say more about it.
I have one more thing to say, but you want to jump in?
Well, I was just going to jump in and say I would be curious what the counter evidence that people would present would be. I mean, coming from the perspective of like, I don't know everything about all of this stuff, and my biblical knowledge is not well enough for me to be like, well, if you want to learn about original sin, you should go to Leviticus chapter 4 and, this passage. So, like, I don't necessarily know how you do that, but I think the argument of, do you know anyone who you look at and don't think there's something fundamentally wrong? I mean, you just see that everywhere. It's the problem, like you said.
Cheerful crowd.
Yeah,
that's what we're thinking.
But kind of the answer to that is what Christ brings to the table, right? So it all comes back around. But so kind of saying, okay, well, so this idea of original sin, even if we were to leave the Bible out of it, whether that's a good thing or not, if we just don't know where to go look for that, it's like, okay, it sure looks like we all do stuff that we're not supposed to do. So it sure looks like we all have original sin, even if I can't prove it to you theologically. But that's why Christ is so great, and what he brings to the table is so great, is because he didn't do that, and then he saved all of us for having that for having that problem. And so it really ties it all together. And I think that bringing Christ back into it is where I would get to, because I say, if you know of anyone that doesn't look like they have this problem going on, let me know. But it sure seems to me like Jesus is the only one, which is outstanding. So.
One more comment on this thread, which is to try not to evade the question of proof. It was Maya, is that right? Maya, yeah. So I wanted to come back to your comment about proof, Maya, and just to tie back to one of the things that Dr. Mark said at the beginning. I think in matters of really not just faith, but really wisdom questions in general and philosophy in general, we don't really deal with proof as much as we accumulate evidence, and proof has a really technical meaning in philosophy that maybe you didn't mean to allude to, but there are very few proofs. But I do want to say this: there is a sense of what sort of evidence is appropriate with regard to specific claims of Christian teaching and claims about God. And one of the things I'd like to point out in this connection is that there's a distinction between those truths about God that can be discovered by natural reason and those truths about God that could only be known through revelation. And there's, in the history of Christian philosophy on this matter, that distinction is very important because it comes to your question of what sort of proof or what kind of evidences matter. And with respect to a lot of things we believe about Jesus and a lot of things we believe indeed about human beings, our main reason for thinking they're true has to do with what's revealed in the Holy Scriptures about the human condition and about God. And the idea is that those things go beyond what we could have proved or established on our own with natural evidence. but they don't conflict it. They don't conflict with it. And that's where Chesterton's quote comes back in. What we're taught to believe about human nature, that it is fallen and corrupted by original sin, actually does. We're taught, and the reasons to believe that largely come from revelation and the evidences that we would have that a revelation is authentic. But nonetheless, what we believe on the basis of revelation does cohere very nicely with what we see through natural reason.
Very good. Next question. State your name.
Hello, I'm Daniel, actually a member of OSO Logos. So I have a question probably specifically for Dr. Marks, because over like evolution, I know you've written a book over that. So a while back in my neuroscience class, we saw a video about a dissection of a giraffe and in their neck, which doesn't happen very often. There's this what's called a laryngeal nerve, which goes all the way down the neck from like from the brain, and then moves back around and innervates the voice box. And a common criticism is that if there was an intelligent designer, he wouldn't make it something so inefficient that it would need to go all the way around to get to here. It would just go like very short route. Yeah.
So what's the question?
Oh, sorry. So how would you respond to that evidence for evolution that there's not an intelligent designer?
Well, I tell you, from the Christian perspective, there's actually three viewpoints about evolution. One is the theistic evolutionists. These are the people that believe, and there's some good Christians that believe this, that Darwinian evolution acted in the way that everybody says Darwinian evolution acted. There is, on the other end of the spectrum, young Earth creationists, which believe in a literal account of the creation that's given in Genesis. And then somewhere in the middle, there's intelligent design. And intelligent design says that in order to have evolution, that the information that we see, the information that we develop, cannot have come from nowhere. We need a designer external to figure out, to explain where we're coming from. I would point out that I have friends with very solid opinions in all three areas that I would account for brothers and sisters in Christ. So I don't know the degree that evolution is an important debate and whether or not you're a Christian. This is the way I feel. I am a proponent of intelligent design because I believe that studying computers, studying the origin of information, how we develop complexity, that cannot have happened by random, undirected chance. The universe is not large enough. I don't know if anybody has ever watched the Dumb and Dumber movie where Jim Carrey talks to Mary Samsonite and asks her what his chance is with her. And he says, is it like 1 in 100? And she says, no, it's 1 in a million. And he has this hesitation and he says, so you're telling me there's a chance? And I think that that's what the theistic evolutions and the Darwinians are saying. So you tell me there's a chance. No, there isn't a chance. And I have a whole book, Introduction to Evolutionary Informatics, available on Amazon.com. Don't buy it used, otherwise I won't get a royalty. But it deals with the mathematics, not the biology, but the mathematics of information and where information comes from. And it's just not possible for information to come from chaos, from emergent behavior, and the universe is not big enough, and even the 10 to the 1,000th parallel universes that string theory purports to maybe exist, even there, that isn't big enough to explain the small probability of chance that we would originate as to the degree that we are. So I don't know if that answers your question. I had no response related to giraffes, but is that good enough?
I have a quip to add,
okay,
actually, if I may. So first, the two important prefaces. First of all, this is a quip. It is not a proof or anything like that. So keep that in mind. But secondly, I don't want to reveal in any way exactly what my stance on this issue is. And so keep that in mind, that this isn't intended to say, oh, that means that Ryan is in this one of the three buckets. And without saying what my own stance is, it seems to me that it's a little bit foolish for somebody to say, that's not how I would have designed it, so therefore there's no designer. That doesn't seem to follow, especially if God is an omnipotent, omniscient being, regardless of the mechanism that he uses to accomplish anything, whether it is special creation, intelligent design, or theistic evolution, or none of the above. if there is a none of the above. Who are we as finite man to say, well, that's not how I would have done it, so clearly God wouldn't have done it that way either. That seems a little bit arrogant. So I would push back on the kind of assumption that we can know why God makes the decisions he does, if in fact he is making those decisions. Anyway, that was just a quip, but it was something that every time that kind of question gets brought up, I think of that.
That's very relevant, because we hear people debating and say, if I was God, I wouldn't have done it this way. These people are looking at this design process from a silo. If they were in engineering, they would know that there are always design trade-offs that are inherent in any design. Cheap cars aren't safe, and safe cars aren't cheap. You have to compromise somewhere. And this goes into all of the design of everybody, that there is trade-offs. And if you just look at one aspect and you say, this cheap car isn't safe, and that's terrible, I wouldn't have done it that way, you don't recognize the spectrum of what we refer to as Pareto optimal, that there isn't one solution, but there is a trade-off in the design process. And it's very irritating to see people in their little silos look afar into engineering design and make statements of that sort. So, okay.
I was going to add something onto that.
Okay,
as well.
Sure.
I think there's a similar point to the point Ryan made about knowing how God would do things. With people maybe make a similar objection about the universe being directed towards life, and saying, if God made the universe for there to be life, why is there only so little life on this one tiny rock in this giant enormous universe? And the response kind of being, well, why are we assuming that God's goal would have been to make the most amount of life possible that would fit in the universe? Like, it's the same kind of answer of, okay, do we know exactly what we would do if we were God? And it's doesn't make sense that he wouldn't do it that way. But I think there's another, in response to saying that this is evidence, okay, for maybe evolution, that there's no God. I think there's something that a lot of people don't consider when understanding what kinds of explanations we're asking for. So John Lennox, who Dr. Marks actually interviewed Dr. Lennox a few days ago, so be on the lookout for that podcast in the next couple months. But John Lennox, he's a pretty well-known mathematician, philosopher of science from Oxford, and he gives kind of an example where he says he asked his class, why does a kettle boil? And they give all kinds of answers. One answer they gave, that he said, this is a good answer. They say, because the flames on the stove are heating up, and they're, heating up the copper basin of the pot, and that's agitating the water molecules and makes it go faster and faster and heating up. He says, no, that's not why the kettle's boiling. The kettle's boiling because I want a cup of tea. And so you laugh because you realize you have to have both of those things. There are different kinds of causes. There are different kinds of explanations. And in order to have a complete explanation, you have to have both of them. And so, and he offers another parallel with Henry Ford and the Ford motor car and the engine. He says, is the cause of this Ford engine, is it Henry Ford, or is it the laws of internal combustion? It's like, well, I mean, it's really both, but you're not going to be able to necessarily see Henry Ford or like a written out law of internal combustion in the engine itself. And so in order to have a complete explanation, you can't say, even if we could completely explain everything without God inside the natural system, that does not in any way rule out God from the question, because he's fundamentally not the same kind of explanation. So, and again, it's like, well, just because we don't understand why he would do something that way, it's like, well, if he is there, then would he not have a larger perspective than we have on how things could go or should go? So I think saying it's either this one or it's either that one. And kind of to Ryan's point too, in terms of like where we are specifically on this issue, it's like, I don't really know that it matters that much, because even if you say, sure, I'll give you theistic evolution, say we figured everything out for physics too. I mean, Richard Dawkins, who's just about as militant of an atheist as they come, in his book, The God Delusion, talks about He's like, we figured it out for biology. We know how everything works naturalistically through biology, but we have no idea how it happened with physics. So like all these things that are just how they are, like gravity and cosmological constant and all these big words, they don't know exactly why they are the way they are. So even if we had explained all of that stuff, though, we're in no way saying that these are even competing explanations. So this is not something that we necessarily have to reconcile. Is it God or is it evolution? It's like, it could be both. I'm not really worried about it. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Good question. Let me move on. Well, let me say one other thing. Science keeps changing, and the critics of evolution would say something like, we got tonsils, we got appendices, we have something in our DNA called junk DNA, which has no function, and no, that keeps changing. The appendix looks to be a reservoir for the growth of flora. A few years ago, I would say maybe a decade, 15 years ago, they discovered that this so-called junk DNA, which they thought was a vestigial leaving of prior evolution, turned out to be not only important but necessary for the reproductive process. In fact, it gave birth to a whole new field called epigenetics. And so one has to be careful about saying things don't have function and such. Next, your name first.
I'm Trip Hankins, and I'm a freshman pre-business. And my question is kind of piggybacking on this. It's just got me thinking: does the idea behind being us being created in the image of God, does that butt heads with theistic evolution in a way that it doesn't butt heads with intelligent design?
You just opened the can of worms.
Oops.
Good question. Who wants to start?
I'll say something about it. So I think one of the central thesis that Christians should care about with respect to evolution is the claim that it is undirected. And when you ask philosophers of science or naturalistic, atheistic philosophers what they mean whenever they say that it's a process that's merely directed by chance, what they say is that there is no known physical process that is governing the outcomes of evolutionary processes. So that's fair enough, but that's not the same as saying it's undirected. There can be no known physical process that is explaining the direction that things take, and still be the case that it is directed. So to me, that's a key point to get on the table and trying to think about whether or not the claim that the human biological form has developed through evolutionary processes, you have to think that's the key claim for me. I mean, when someone says science shows that we were just an accident, I think that's not true. And I think that is a claim that conflicts with what the Christian revelation reveals about how we were made. But I think the claim that's false is that science establishes that. I think science establishes a weaker claim, that there's no known physical cause.
Let me chime in and also mention that we see these conflicts here. There's a physicist, I believe he's either Oxford or Cambridge, named John Polkinghorne. He was where was Stephen Hawking at? He was a colleague of Hawking's. Was that at Cambridge? Or?
He was Cambridge.
Cambridge.
Hawking
Okay,
was
so
Cambridge.
Polkinghorne was at Cambridge. He was a colleague of Stephen Hawking's. He got to the point and said, "You know what? I want to quit being a professor and I want to go back to seminary." So he became a priest. He went back, and not a priest, but he went back and got his degree. And he has some very interesting insights into some of these questions. One of which always struck me is he said conflicts of today are often resolved at higher levels. He points back to the conflict at the turn of the century that light was a particle. No, it's a wave. And there was a big argument. Well, it turns out it was resolved at a higher level, that it was both a particle and a wave. And that was the resolution. So I believe that actually the Genesis account and the intelligent design sort of things are possibly consistent. There's a great book written by the Science of God, Schrodinger. Schroeder, the science of God, he's a physicist in Israel, and he actually went through the idea of time dilation. You know what time dilation is? In physics, as I understand it, time dilation means that time is slowing down. So that if we went back billions and billions and billions of years, everybody would be talking like Donald Duck, because time would be going faster. And what he did, he detrended this time dilation. And much like you would take the inflation, you would adjust for inflation, prices for past inflation. And so he adjusted for past inflation, and he laid out right next to it the Genesis account. And they line up in a spooky manner. Just incredible. So could this be a resolution of this conflict at a higher level? Possibly, but it's still an interesting thought that today's conflicts are actually resolved in the future by understanding things at higher levels.
One other thought that I have, and I'm going to attack it from a slightly different angle on the image of God side. So part of the question hinges on what exactly do we mean by the image of God? Now, I think that maybe when we're young and less mature in our faith and our theology, specifically more so than our faith, it's tempting to think that the image of God means in the human form, right? That you look like I look, or like Dr. Marks looks, or anybody in the audience looks, that it's something to do with the structure that we take. But that's really not what image of God means, is it? Image of God, I think, from a theological perspective, tends to be more on the spiritual side. And we see that humans, not only do we look different from other creatures, we do, but all creatures look different from one another. But we're something else. And that comes at a kind of cognitive awareness, not beyond that even. There's a dimension to humanity which is wholly unlike other creatures on this earth. And I forget the name of the gentleman, but somebody who's a fellow at the Discovery Institute has written a whole book on human exceptionalism. And I think that's kind of, I don't know all the theology behind this, but I suspect that the image of God gets kind of wrapped up in that idea, that there's something very unique about the human race that is beyond just our biology, beyond our anatomical structure, things which are explained by the mechanism of evolution, special creation, or intelligent design, but really aren't necessarily dependent on that mechanism. So I think that once we separate the physical structure from the spiritual element of it, there's less of a perceived conflict between whatever the mechanism may have been versus whether or not we are in fact made in the image of God. At least that's how I tend to think about it.
Thank you very much. Excellent question. We need to wrap this up, so let's go through the final two questions. And yes, the last guy in line, yes. Okay, so state your name and then the question.
Hi, my name's Terry. So as a believer from a Buddhist family and from Asia, the question I found it very challenging to answer is what about those people who've never heard of Jesus, and especially before the time of Jesus, and before internet and airplane. So what's the requirement of salvation, I guess, before Jesus?
So a little isolated tribe in Africa that has never had the opportunity of knowing about Christ, how could they be?
Because a lot of Christians will use that passage from Romans and saying if you look at the nature, it's obvious that there's a creator. But there are many religions that worship nature. So obviously they acknowledge that there's something higher power than human. So does that kind of fulfill the requirement of believing in a God or Christian God?
Excellent question. Yes. Response.
If I can at least start it off in terms of saying, this is the way it is, that's another thing. The way that I understand it, from the more Calvinist, to put a giant stereotype box on top of people, from the Calvinist perspective, the way I understand it, they normally say that it's like, well, if maybe like the odds are if you had heard the message, you would not have been interested anyways. And as such, you probably would not go to heaven. Whereas from the Armenian perspective, it's more of kind of, there's more in terms of, okay, well, if they thought maybe there's a God that created all this stuff, even if I don't know who he is, didn't really have the have any way to know about specifically who it was, but they think there's something out there, and they're trying to figure out what it is, and they're worshiping it in some way, even if they don't know exactly what it is. Maybe that's a way in, even if they don't necessarily know the name Jesus, because they never had the opportunity. They never had the opportunity to even hear that name. And so those seem to be at least the two potential ways to look at it. Either they never heard it, they couldn't possibly do it, or maybe there's a chance depending on exactly how they acted. So, and I think in it, and you guys may correct me on this, but most of the conversations I've had about this have either been if the people lean more Calvinist leaning, then that tends to be their answer, and if they lean more towards the other way, they tend to answer that direction. So I don't know if that's just a shallow way of looking at it, but.
Well, I don't want to disagree with anything Casey put on the table, but I just want to highlight something that I think matters in this context, at least to me, whenever I'm thinking about your question. It is a very probing and deep question. I was personally really challenged by it at a certain point in my own faith development. So I hear where you're coming from. One of the things that I came to see when I was thinking about this was that there's a doctrine. I gave it the name no postmortem chances. Doctrine of no postmortem chances. And I'll say what I mean by that in a second. It's a doctrine that really informs most of what you're hearing Christians say about this when they talk about it. And I was hearing the same thing. And it has got no biblical basis that I can find. And it's a doctrine that informs a lot of what Christians say about salvation and about who is saved, but I cannot find the slightest shred of biblical support for it. So it's one of these cases where I came to see that a lot of what I thought was core Christian teachings, I could not find an adequate biblical basis for it. So what I mean by the doctrine of no postmortem chances is, and I'm just telling you what I thought. So if others disagree with me, feel free. I recognize I'm climbing out on a limb. What I mean by the doctrine of no postmortem chances is that the only opportunities to accept or reject the gift of salvation offered through Jesus Christ, knowingly and willingly, happens on this side of the grave. That there may be a good biblical argument for it that I don't know of, but as I say, so it seems to me fairly consistent to say there is no salvation but in Christ, and that everybody gets a fair shot at it. And if they don't get it in this life, there's no reason that I can see to think that they would be ruled out in the life to come. But of course, I'm being very speculative, and I'm just saying the main point I'm trying to make is that I don't think there's a good biblical foundation for the doctrine of no postmortem chances. But of course, I'm out on a limb here, so I welcome the opposition.
So I have a couple thoughts. First of all, I'm actually very intrigued by what Dr. Buras just mentioned, but so my comments were, perhaps this is poor form, formulated before Dr. Buras had made his response, and so it will not take into account anything that you brought up, but I'll grant you is extremely intriguing and that I'd have to think about more. But something that I always think about with this question, and disclaimer is that this is not a fun, nice answer, but it's kind of a logical one. What do we mean by fair? If we're saying that when somebody, why is it fair that somebody in the South Pacific they grow up and they never hear the gospel, and so then they die? And putting aside the question of whether or not there's any post-mortem opportunities, say that even irrespective of that they never have the opportunity to hear the gospel and they never come to faith in Christ because of that. Well, why is that fair? Is the question that's raised. Well, I'll tell you exactly why that is fair. Has that person sinned? Has that person committed injustices against the holy God Almighty, who is perfectly just, perfectly holy, and demands perfect obedience from all of his creation? I mean, that's true. We like to think of Jesus meek and mild, Jesus the loving, great moral teacher, but Jesus is more than that. God is more than that. He is also holy, and he is also just, and justice requires justice, frankly. And so the fact that anybody gets grace is itself, think about what the word grace means. Grace is unmerited favor. And so the fact that any of us would get salvation is in fact not fair. It is a violation of the principle of fairness, and that's why it's grace. That's not really a great thing. So that's the logical thing that I always think about. I don't think that's what you go tell somebody who's struggling with this issue. I know that Dr. Buras kind of mentioned that with the problem of evil in the beginning. This is my turn to kind of turn myself in and say, don't say that to your friend who's struggling with this issue. But that is how I think about part of it, is that all people have sinned. All people have fallen short of the glory of God. And so really none of us deserve salvation. It's a gift to anyone. But the second thing that I like to think about, and without playing either a Calvinist, Molinist, Arminian, any of the theology cards from any side of the aisle, think about the properties of God. God is both omniscient, omnipresent, and omnipotent. God does have knowledge of all things. Now, whether or not he forces people into decisions in the sense that a 5-point Calvinist would argue that he does, or whether or not free will plays into it to a greater extent, God knows the people who will be his subjects, who will seek after him, irrespective of the mechanism of how that is accomplished. And so I believe that it would be a violation of God's goodness if he knew of a person who, had they only heard, they would be his servant, but they never heard, and he allows that person to be condemned because of that. That seems to be a violation of his goodness in light of the fact that he knows that, because he's omniscient. And so I don't know the mechanism. I tend to flip-flop sides when it comes to what theological perspective I come from. But I do, at the end of the day, I put my faith that God is omniscient, that he is omnipotent, and he is omnipresent, and so that he will not allow that kind of a violation of his good nature to occur. So taking into consideration our false understanding of what fairness is, coupled with God's characteristics, I think this problem becomes less of a problem, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you. Good question. Our last question. State your name and baffle us.
Hey, everybody. My name is Mitchell Eloquin. I'm a junior studying religion and accounting here at Baylor. My question actually pertains slightly to what I might call like therapeutic theology that's based out of that very question. In reading Paul's letter to the church in Rome, some scholars interpret it and unpack Paul's idea of new creation as a cosmic new creation, that all things are made new in him. And that's kind of linchpinned by the cross. So that's usually, or not usually, but that can be applied in a Christian universalist setting, such that if all things are being made new in Christ, then that process of new creation is also sort of incorporated with salvation. I'm curious how you guys would think about or unpack the ideas that exist kind of in alongside Christian universalism, such as a conception of hell, such as a conception of the new creation, and how to really comprehend what those terms mean in light of scriptural interpretation.
Okay, thank you. 20 words or less. Go.
That is an impossible task to answer that in 20 words or less.
It was a joke.
We could talk for a long time about Romans and what Paul is doing with his new creation language. The progressive unfolding of, or the unfolding of the new creation, the making of all things new, on my reading, is distinct from claims about who makes it in. It's a cosmological promise about the scope of salvation, and the scope of salvation is an offer, but I do think that it's an offer that may be rejected or renounced. And one worry that I would have about Christian universalist claims is that they undermine the distinctiveness of the possibility of renouncing, of rejecting this thing. I think God honors the creature, and he honors the creature so much that he allows the creature to reject him. And from my standpoint, whatever we make of post-mortem opportunities, it does seem like there's a kind of post-mortem fixing of the will that goes on, such that the apprehension of God sets the character of the individual in a way that becomes irrevocable and final. And for the blessed, for those who respond to the vision of God with worship, that's a fixing of their character that would be a beatification, right? A completion of it. And to use traditional language, for the damned, that's a fixing of their character in a way that where God honors them by giving them the freedom of that final and permanent choice. How does that fit within the new creation? When God creates, he creates the heavens and the earth, and he creates the sun and the moon, and the light and the dark, and the light has a shadow side. There's a principle of not light, which is in one way built into the structure of creation. And the new creation, in one sense, ratifies that structure in a hard way, right? Musically, there's a bass note to creation, and it doesn't go away. And within the sort of totality of God's order and God's providence and God's goodness, those who reject and renounce God are folded into the grand narrative in ways that, by virtue of their renunciation, they unwittingly and ironically end up praising the one who they have renounced. Because even the stones will cry out, right? And so in that sense, those who are damned do end up doing what they don't want to do, to use Paul's language in Romans 7, offering praise to the one by way of their rejection. That's all very confusing. I mean, that's a paradoxical answer, but the thing with Christianity that's so great is Christian doctrines tend to have these sorts of paradoxes and these sorts of ironies embedded and woven throughout them. It's a highly ironic faith, it seems to me. That's the beginnings of an answer.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Good question. You'll notice here today we weren't totally agreed on everything. There wasn't consensus. But there is one thing I think everybody on this panel agrees with, and that is we are all fallen. We are all sinners, including you. We all need a Savior. And Jesus Christ, the Son of God, died on the cross to pay for our sin. And accepting his offer of salvation is what a Christian is all about. And then after accepting his salvation, to begin a trust in him. That is the foundation on which Christianity is built and is something that we all agree in and that all Christians agree in. So thank you for coming. I'd like you to join me in thanking our panel tonight. We have, the panel will stick around if you want to talk to them individually. Is that okay? You don't have any place to go. Okay. And
it is now, apparently.
Yeah, it is. Okay. And there's also still some pizza and some soft drinks in the back, so feel free. And thank you for coming.
I really liked that last answer.